our public transport systems are in disarray in many areas. Buses, trains, taxis, not always readily available. A group in Cape Town is urging commuters to cycle to work, however. It's certainly better for the environment, easier on the pocket, and it's very healthy. But given the legacy of apartheid spatial planning, which put townships far from city centres, is it practical? Let's speak now to Roland Postma, Managing Director of the non-profit Young Urbanists of South Africa. Roland, thank you so much for joining us. You know, it's such an interesting time that the story comes to us because, of course, we're seeing that our taxis are staying away, our buses are under siege, and in places like New York and London, and of course Amsterdam's been doing it for decades and decades, cycling is absolutely huge. And there's even more interest because it's so climate friendly. But in a city like Cape Town, any big city, given what happened during apartheid, where black and brown people were pushed out far from the city centre, how practical is it?
I mean, it's a great question. With anything, even given the example, looking at Netherlands, at some point they had to choose between building more highways that we have in our cities to investing in public spaces, cycling spaces for pedestrians. So it is very practical, it's very possible. We have to start making that decision by not just having progressive policies, but where we actually allocate our budgets. Now, in the context of apartheid spatial planning and our contemporary problems around our transportation crisis, like we're seeing the taxi strike here in Cape Town, there's a lot of challenges. Now, cycling won't replace taxis or public transportation like rail, but it can be part of the solution. I think the point we want to make that cycling, A, is not a white man's sport. Furthermore, it has a lot of benefits, and if it's safe to cycle, it's safe to walk. We do have to remember that from the last Housing National Census, more than 60% of our school children walk to school every day. And that's why we're advocating for infrastructure, not just here in Cape Town, but across the country.
It's such an important point that you make. If you're having to walk, you might as well cycle. But there are safety concerns on a number of levels. First of all, it's about putting up the right barriers so that kids are actually safe when they're on their bikes because they are going at speed. And we know motorists don't always obey the rules of the road. We know that there's already cycle lanes in, I think it's Lisbjerg, Salt River, Milderton Cycleway, and the N1 Cycleway. Also, there are plans for cycle paths for Mitchell's Plain and Khayelitsha. But again, concern about safety. And I would imagine it's safety not just about the barriers I've mentioned, but also things like, you know, gang warfare and your bike being stolen from under you as you ride it. So talk to me about how you're overcoming those challenges.
Of course, it does start with infrastructure. We know that cycling lane with paint is actually worse than having no cycling lane at all. What that does, it creates a false perception of safety. So what we're working with the City of Cape Town, we're pleased to report that going forward, any cycling lane on a higher level road, there'll be cycling barriers. Now, but what's important is also these cycling lanes being connected. All those cycling lanes you just mentioned are not connected to one another. Imagine having a road but does not connect to your destination, and that's the reality for cycling lanes here in Cape Town and across the country. Now, in terms of other violence, I think it's infrastructure, but then how do we create safety, particularly for people living in very unsafe areas outside of former white-only areas? And there's many ways. It can be done through bike buses. These are things we are supporting through communities. Particularly, you know, you mentioned if it's safe to walk, it's safe to cycle, particularly for our school children. So bike buses, I think, can be very powerful. So once we do have critical mass, it really
so sorry to interrupt. What is a bike bus? Just explain that to me.
A bike bus is where communities come together and they cycle. I think a great little example is anyone, your listeners, please Google Barcelona bike bus, where particularly for schools come together and lots of children from the age of 4 to 9 cycle together. And what it does, it creates safety. So you have infrastructure, you have community coming together. It's better for businesses. Evidence across the world has shown cars actually bad for business. We can't build our way out of congestion. But then another thing that you didn't mention is affordability of bicycles. This is very important, the role of both the private sector and government to incentivize bicycles. It's quite cheap, and we can very easily retrofit our existing infrastructure, not having to spend billions to make it safer and connect to public transportation. And so it's not an ideological argument, it's not a privilege argument, it's actually an equity, and it's an economical, and it had so many other benefits for not just our economy, but also our climate.
I mean, as you're saying, it makes sense on so many levels, but the infrastructure has to be there and it has to be safe. Talk to me about how many people realistically in Cape Town are actually cycling to school and work compared to the people that go out for a beautiful cycle on a Sunday morning in their lycra and then have a coffee. Nothing wrong with that, but the reality is cycling is so underutilised, I suspect, in Cape Town. But you have the details. Have you had any breakthroughs with communities starting to cycle to school and work?
So most of our partners are actually in places like Langa, Dunoon, Khayelitsha. In fact, a lot of people that we know cycle to Stellenbosch from Khayelitsha to Strands and other areas. So it's already a reality. A lot of gardeners, workers, domestic workers are cycling because it's a cheap alternative. You know, one tank of petrol is basically you can buy a bicycle. The thing about petrol, it's not going to go away, but it's going to get more expensive. And last time I checked, no one can really afford a brand new electrical vehicle. So bicycles is actually an equity and a solution. So there's a lot of challenges. And of course, we do have a perception that cycling is this white person sport or white privilege. And that's not the reality. A lot of people are cycling, but then also we need to really talk about commuting cycling because there's a lot of been emphasis, particularly in Cape Town, around recreational cycling, where people cycle with 100k bikes, far more expensive. But the fact of the matter is a lot of people from very unprivileged backgrounds do cycle. And essentially we want a South Africa where it's safe to cycle, where the rich use public transportation and the poor use cars. That's the kind of society I want to create for our colleagues and partners. And ultimately, it's an economical argument, and also it's a rational argument.
It's an absolutely brilliant initiative, and keep at it. I think what you said really hit home. One tank of petrol can buy a bicycle. Thank you so much, Roland Postma, Managing Director of Young Urbanists of South Africa.